Welcome to our 2022 All Saints concert. Everybody who's here in the room and everybody who's watching around the area, the country, and perhaps around the world, we welcome you all. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes talking about the background of some of this music, which I hope is helpful to you in appreciating it as we present it. Today's concert features the work of two composers, Ralph Vaughan Williams, who is from the UK, and Maurice Duruflé, who is from France. Both of them were mid-20th century composers, but the works we're presenting today harken back to previous times. We're not, although written in the middle of the 20th century, we're not totally 20th century pieces. For example, Vaughan Williams' Serenade to Music is a setting of a scene from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, which is a play he wrote in the late 16th century. Duruflé's Requiem, although written in the 1940s, is based on 7 Gregorian chants for the dead from the 12th and 13th century, from the Benedictine monastery. Clearly, their music transcends its own time and own space and subsumes the poetry and music of the ages, and I think it speaks to us today. This year is the 150th anniversary of the birth of Ralph Vaughan Williams. It's spelled Ralph, but he pronounced it in the Old English Rafe. Thus, if you're in the UK today, you're hearing lots of Ralph Vaughan Williams' work. Even here in the US, on Palm Sunday, we presented his 5 mystical songs. To some critics, Vaughan Williams was the greatest English composer of the 20th century. He was born October 12, 1872, just over 150 years ago, and he was descended on his father's side from the Darwins of Charles Darwin fame, and on his mother's side from the Wedgwood of Wedgwood china fame. His father was a priest, a vicar in the Anglican Church, and he died when Vaughan Williams was only 2 years old. But here's a brief anecdote related by his mother. At age 7, Ralph knew that his great-uncle, Charles Darwin, had written a controversial book called The Origin of the Species. The boy asked me what it was all about. I replied, "The Bible says that God made the world in 6 days. Great-uncle Charles thinks it took a lot longer. But we need not worry about it, for it's equally wonderful either way." Vaughan Williams went on, never forgot those words, and I think the rest of his life he spent trying to be a Christian and being agnostic and bouncing back and forth between the two. He began to compose when he was 6 years old, and as you might imagine, his first piece was for solo piano and was called The Robin's Nest. It has not survived. However, music wasn't a career path which the family approved. So Ralph was a comparatively late starter in music. He started studying history at Trinity College, Cambridge. Meanwhile, on the side, he took some side composition lessons from Charles Wood and Charles Stanford of the faculty there. Later, he decided to up his game, and he took lessons with composers Max Bruch, who was in Berlin, and Maurice Ravel in Paris. His wife, Ursula, described his faith as cheerful agnosticism, inspired throughout his life by the liturgy of the Anglican Church, the language of the King James Bible, and the visionary qualities of religious verse, such as George Herbert's. George Herbert was the poet that wrote the libretto for the 5 mystical songs we did back on Palm Sunday. One of Vaughan Williams' most significant accomplishments was as musical editor of a book called The English Hymnal. It was a collection published in 1906, which served as the model for all subsequent hymn books and collections, not only in the Anglican Church, but in churches worldwide. Up until that time, there was not really a comprehensive hymnal like we are used to using and having in the pew rack in front of us. A famous Ralph Vaughan Williams quote that's a lesson for all of us is, "I always try to remember the value of encouragement. Sometimes a callow youth appears who may be a fool or may be a genius, and I would rather be guilty of encouraging a fool than of discouraging a genius." Wise words. So today we're presenting his Serenade to Music as well as several hymn arrangements. Vaughan Williams wrote Serenade to Music in 1938 as a tribute to Sir Henry Wood, who was a famous British conductor, also a composer. Sir Henry is best remembered as the founding father of the proms, and many of you probably have attended the proms if you've been in London in July or August. Today, the proms are known as the BBC Henry Wood Promenade Concerts. The proms present serious music in an informal atmosphere, trace their lineage back to 1895, and were actually founded by Sir Henry Wood. So for the Gala Jubilee in 1938, which was held in Royal Albert Hall, the same place the proms are held, and of course it was conducted by Sir Henry Wood, Vaughan Williams had the idea to write a piece dedicated to him that would have 16 English singers featuring them in solos as well as a chorus, plus full orchestra, and using Shakespeare's words from The Merchant of Venice. Vaughan Williams went so far as to put the initials of each of those 16 singers in the score. So the scores we sing from today have these initials before each part, as well as at the front an index so we can trace who they were. We're not going to use 16 soloists because we don't have enough space here. Instead, we will have our 4 soloists group together and do the solo parts, and the choir do the ensemble parts. Vaughan Williams chose as his text a passage from The Merchant of Venice that I think many of us remember. "How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon the bank. Here will we sit and let the sounds of music creep in our ears. Soft stillness and the night becomes the touches of sweet harmony." And then it goes on for several more couplets. The words come from Act 5 of The Merchant of Venice. Lorenzo and Jessica are at Belmont and sit listening to the music, gazing at the stars, and reveling in the magic of the night. The music is really exquisitely sweet and tender, what Vaughan Williams wrote and what we will present today. So tender that at the premiere in Royal Albert Hall, as a guest of Sir Henry was Sergei Rachmaninoff, the great Russian pianist and composer. And he wept as he heard the piece, and afterward reported that he had never been so moved by a piece of music. Turning to Shakespeare, just a little background. Little is known about Shakespeare's personal musical abilities, but one thing is certain: his verbal art has over the centuries inspired all sorts of music and had a great impact on music of the ages. In fact, if you go through all of his plays, there are more than 300 stage directions for various types of music to be inserted into his plays. 300. In addition, there is indication, request for incidental music And perhaps what we remember best as incidental music is Mendelssohn's incidental music to A Midsummer Night's Dream that ended up with Here Comes the Bride. But these two categories don't count the many instrumental works, operas, ballets, and other stage works based on Shakespeare's text, including Serenade to Music Today. The 5-volume Shakespeare Music Catalog, which was published in 1991 and hasn't been updated, listed more than 21,000 Shakespeare-inspired works. And I imagine since in the last 30 years, that number has probably gone up to 25 or maybe even 30,000 works inspired by Shakespeare. So now I'll move to Maurice Duruflé. The year was 1941. He was living in Paris, teaching at the conservatory, and the Nazis had conquered France and were roaming the streets of Paris. The Nazi puppet Vichy government demanded that French composers write music that supported the new regime. Duruflé accepted a commission, he couldn't turn it down, to write a symphonic poem. However, in resistance to the Nazis and the Vichy government, he dawdled so much that the war ended, his father passed away, and finally he completed the work in 1947 and dedicated it to his father, his Requiem. His father had been a successful architect, had a passion for music, and to his delight, his son would play from memory on his harmonium in their house chants and choral music that he had heard in Mass when they had gone to Mass, Catholic Mass. Like so many composers, Maurice was a prodigy. He was given solfege and piano lessons from the age of 5, and his mother taught him piano and included him in recitals with her own students. But as with so many families of prodigies, they didn't know what to do with him. How do we educate our special child? So they decided to send him away from home at 10 years old to be a boarding chorister at the school that was serving Rouen Cathedral. However, Duruflé described this early schooling experience as one of imprisonment. He went from a warmly supportive home into the rigorous discipline of the choir school, where he would do music 14 to 18 hours a day. Combination of a number of things, as well as singing for the worship services in the cathedral. Duruflé later said his only joy was in choir and singing as a member of the group. And he enjoyed learning works of Bach, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Fauré, and others. After he left Rouen, he went home, became an organist in his local parish church, and his father paid for him to travel to Paris twice a week for organ lessons. He studied with Charles Tournemire at the conservatory, and they didn't get along. In fact, it got so bad that Tournemire sent him to the conservatory several years early. He knew he was a precocious kid, he just wanted to pass him along. And then at the conservatory, he won prizes, amazingly, in organ, harmony, counterpoint, fugue, composition. He was an ace student. And after he graduated there, he stayed and taught for 26 years. He also went on to a brilliant career as a concert organist as well as a composer, and yet he would always remain self-critical. In fact, he destroyed all but 14 of his compositions. And we are blessed that the Requiem was one that he did not destroy. By the way, Chopin destroyed many of his compositions, perhaps more than half of his work. Turning to his wife, in 1953, Duruflé was 51, and he married Marie Madeleine Chevalier, who was a student 19 years younger, who was a student at the conservatory. She brought to their relationship a joy in life that he had sorely lacked. She helped him socially, artistically, and professionally. Their careers joined because they played organ concerts together all over France, Europe, and even the US. She also composed and taught, but was best known for her virtuosity on the organ. She did encourage him to share his compositions with the public, and part of the reason we know of these 14 is because she promoted them even after he died. During her concert tours with her husband, she was known to play the most technically demanding works. In an interview for the New York Times in 1989, she admitted it was on purpose. This is a quote, "My husband was a very great virtuoso at the organ. When once he became my husband, I worked harder than he did." He used to tell me often, "You will play the most difficult pieces, and I will play the ones of interpretation." There's a wonderful YouTube video of Mrs. Duruflé being interviewed by Robert Schuller at Crystal Cathedral. And her personality, bubbling personality, comes across in about the first 10 minutes, and then she goes on for another 5 or 6 minutes to play just an astounding work on the organ, and they show it on camera. It's too long for me to show to you today, but if you're interested, look on YouTube for Mrs. Duruflé and see that video. So the Mass for the Dead, the piece we're doing today, is made up of chants actually originated by the early Christians in Rome. If you remember, in Rome, Christians were forced to worship in the catacombs, 96 miles of catacombs underneath the streets of Rome. And some of these chants trace their lives back to those Christians underground in Rome. Duruflé chose those chants, but with music from the 12th and 13th centuries, from the Benedictines of Solesmes, and set that in his Requiem. And you will hear us as we sing it, sometimes the women, sometimes the men, sometimes everybody together, doing just wonderful chants on top of nice full chords from the orchestra. One thing I'd like to point out is they're called Gregorian chants because Pope Gregory I, who was Pope from 590 to 604, 14 years, brought music back into the church after it had been banned for 400 years. And he brought it back through these chants. On this slide is a quote from Duruflé. "I've done my best to reconcile as far as possible the Gregorian rhythms, that which has been fixed by the Benedictines of Solesmes, with the demands of modern meters." He goes on the next slide, to say this Requiem is not an ethereal work which sings detached from worldly anxiety. It reflects in the unchangeable form of the Christian prayer, the anguish of humankind facing the mystery of their last ending. It's often dramatic, or filled with resignation, or hope, or terror, like the same words of the scripture used in the liturgy. It tries to translate into human feeling in the face of our terrifying, inexplicable, or consoling destiny. But what he's trying to say is that heretofore, requiems were nasty pieces that spoke of the dark side of death. And Duruflé's Requiem builds on Fauré's Requiem to say that, remember that once we die, we're moving on to heaven, which is not a terrible place. It's a great place, and we should look forward to that. Big change in emphasis between 1880 and 1940 and today. So moving on, we're also going to do a piece setting of Psalm 23. 23 is many of our favorite psalms. It's probably the most familiar psalm from the Bible. It's probably the favorite chapter in the Bible. And today's setting is by an English composer still alive named John Rutter for choir and orchestra, featuring an oboe solo. And he chose not to use a contemporary text, but to use the 1611 King James text. Turning to the oboe, one could argue that in order to be a shepherd, you must play the oboe. Shepherds for years have been depicted, as in this Dutch painting, as oboe players. Our principal oboist, Maurice Duruflé, will do the solo today, but I guarantee she's not a shepherd. And since Queen Elizabeth passed away last month, we're also doing a piece for her. I did not put her in our saints slide sequence, but because we were all saddened by the death, the passing of the UK's longest serving monarch, I thought we should do a piece that she was involved with. Because Queen Elizabeth was a staunch Christian and avid churchgoer. This picture shows the same spot in Westminster Abbey. The black and white is on her coronation day. The color was on her funeral procession. And for her coronation, Vaughan Williams suggested that for the first time at any coronation service, that the congregation be allowed to sing. Heretofore, coronations were always preached, or they had professional choirs sing, but the congregation never could sing. So he proposed the inclusion of a hymn that the congregation could join in. And this turned out to be very controversial. The committee couldn't decide, and they sent it to Queen Elizabeth and said, "Ma'am, you make up your mind. What do you want?" And she said, "Absolutely, let's include the congregation." And now in the UK, in not just coronations, but all sorts of royalty-involved services, the congregation sings. So we're going to do that arrangement. It's a setting of Old 100th Psalm tune, and we will close our concert and invite you to stand and join us in singing the same one that Vaughan Williams wrote for Queen Elizabeth in 1953. So that concludes my comments for today. I'd like to invite the choir and orchestra to join me up here so we can get started with a concert. And again, thank you for coming here in person as well as coming online.